So I thought we'd try that. Just to review what we've been doing, we had 3 sessions, and we started with some biblical images of war and also of just Christian life. And what you get is a spread of things when you do that. You can look and see that in the book of Joshua, you've got a portrait of war that is it's total war, kind of holy war, huh? And that's one portrait that's there. And then you've got some other things going on. You've got in teaching of Jesus and so forth, something that comes close to a kind of pacifism in the teaching of Jesus. Now, it's hard to tell exactly how to apply teachings of Jesus to wartime and things of that sort. Jesus does not have a whole lot to say about civil governments and the way they're set up. And the New Testament has some things to say about that, but it also doesn't have tons to say about it. The New Testament's mostly concerned with setting up a church. Jesus is mostly concerned with a ministry where he is peripatetic. He walks around places and does stuff. And so he's not really talking in detail about how governments are set up and things of that sort. It was no big deal, really. You don't have to talk about everything all the time. And he's got a message that things are centered on. So we talked about that. He has a kind of radical ethic when you put it all together with Jesus. It's not really so much like a lot of other ethics. And you can see when you've got that, if you've got love your enemies even, that means love of neighbor is infinitely extended. It can't go any further than that. Love your enemies is not a typical phrase in the history of ethics. Love your neighbor, sure. Who is your neighbor? Things like that. All those sorts of things can be talked about, but love your enemies is pretty distinctive. You don't see that too often. And then we've got, also I talked about notions of justice in the Bible. You can take a look in the book of Amos, and justice comes up and so forth. And then you can also ask and put a little trick with the story of the Good Samaritan. What happens if 3 Samaritans show up early while the guy is being beaten by the robbers? What is the way to be neighbor then? And that can give you a kind of entree into kind of a just war tradition, limited use of force under certain circumstances, and you ask how and when. Of the 3 stances that I talked about, I really prefer a kind of combination of just war with international humanitarian law that you have now, which is an imperfect thing. Look, just war tradition is an imperfect thing. Why do I prefer it? I prefer them because I think you can make use of them to frame public discussions about particular wars. And where are you likely to have those discussions? The answer to that is in constitutional democracies, more or less, where people and their representatives can have a discussion. So that kind of thing is, I think, of some help in those environments. We can just pass these things back there. So I think that's a virtue of those positions. The just war position can engage what nations and empires and other things do once in a while. International law can also do it. But I need to say that I have a lot of admiration for a kind of strict Christian pacifism, which I don't think engages in those discussions in the same way. And it seems to me has a lot to commend it in terms of teaching of Jesus, example of Jesus, and other sorts of things. A strong preference for nonviolent means. It's also true that a kind of strict Christian pacifism exposes a kind of ambiguity in the stances that I prefer. The stances I prefer can involve you in public conversations about wars with nations, empires, and so forth. But just war theory and international law almost never completely prevent whole wars, right? I mean, that you are in discussions about them. You can sort of kind of curtail them. You can criticize and so forth. But it's not the case that a whole bunch of just war theorists can list a bunch of wars that you're simply not going to participate in and that people didn't participate in. So one of the ambiguities of the stance that I prefer is it gives you a chance to talk about stuff, but things don't always turn out so happily. Now, I think the same thing is true actually for Christian pacifism, if you want to know the truth, which simply does not really engage what nations and empires do directly, and the wars proceed. So you've got a troubled kind of a moral question here, and I think it's important to keep the troubles with it in mind. Okay, so there is a third stance, and that is the holy war stance. But despite its continued presence, some people talk about, for instance, in the contemporary frame, a clash between Christian and Muslim civilizations with God on one side or the other. And actually, if you take the time, you'll have God on both one side or the other, Muslims and Christians. I think that position, while it recurs, is so theologically troubled that you can dismiss it as a genuine Christian position. I don't think it can really take account of Jesus, okay, let's put it in simple terms. And I think you just got a problem there. And you have a problem with questions of justice. It is one that people take up once in a while. And I think when Dave was talking in the sermon and he talked about the one student, I mean, that comes close to that sort of thing, right? I mean, you simply identify my country right or wrong, and there you go. My country right or wrong, if you think about it, is a kind of tough way to go in Christian ethics. My country right or wrong when it introduces slavery? Are you sure? I mean, do you want to criticize then? My country right or wrong when it, I don't know, some countries, you know, kill 8 million Jews? I mean, is it time? My country right or wrong, I understand that it's a kind of commitment, and it has it in a sense in some ways, but as a strict moral principle, it doesn't work out too well. I would prefer my country trying to do things right. And it doesn't always get it right, but I prefer that. Okay, so, and you know, if you also think about some American traditions, it's one nation under God. It's not one nation that's equivalent to God. And, you know, that's kind of a nice move, I think, on the part of a lot of that things in American history. Okay, so let's talk about some current international norms and how they track just limited or just war theory, and it's on that sheet that I gave you there. Limited or just war theory has a number of points in it. We've reviewed them before, but we'll just go through them again. Some of them have to do with decisions about going to war. Just cause is the first one. And the idea there is that reasons for going to war include defense of innocent life and responding to an imminent threat or an attack. That's the basic move there. Right intention is another one. Well, what is your intention or your objective in the conflict? Self-defense and establishing a stronger peace, and then you need to specify what that would be, the purpose. I can't just, in just war theory, I can't just go to war if I feel like taking your harbor or something. I mean, I got to have something better reason than that, huh? It's got to. Last resort doesn't mean that you've tried everything else first. It means that you try other avenues first, namely negotiations. You don't go immediately to armed conflict if you can keep from doing that. Legitimate authority is one of them. That's really a question of what's recognized by a nation's government, and the reason it's in there is, you see, just war theory goes through a whole long, long history, right? And you don't want some people just sort of wildcats declaring war all of a sudden and running it. You want to have some legitimate authority in some ways to talk about that authority and how it's limited. And so the idea is, well, I don't know, if you were watching, like, you know, some of these shows, The Sopranos or something like that, you can't just have an Italian gang, you know, declare war. I can say that because I'm an Italian kid, okay? And I'm from New Jersey too, so all that stuff. You need to have more legitimate authority than that. Proportionality, you need to balance the costs of the war with the values that are defended. Every war is very, very costly in terms of lives and in terms of material and so forth. And one question is, well, you know, is the objective of the values being defended worth it? Huh? I mean, that kind of stuff. And that's an important point for political leadership, you know. I mean, you know, you can read up on Dwight Eisenhower the day before the D-Day invasion, and he's going to meet troops in different places and asking who's from Kansas, because he's from Kansas, right? I mean, he knows he's sending a number of people to die, right? And he doesn't want to do that unless there's an objective that is somehow, in some sense, worth it, huh? It's a troubled position to be in. Okay, and then you've got reasonable hope of success, which is supposed to exclude reckless fighting. You know, you don't send people to try and take an objective when there's just no chance. These are some of the criteria just war theory. Then you have justice in the conduct of war. It's basically two criteria. One is called discrimination. That prohibits direct attacks on civilians and non-combatants. Hospitals, schools, etc. like that. Soda shops, if it comes to that. Apartment complexes, right? Things like that. And the other is proportionality. Is the good pursued by a specific act of war, specific engagement, commensurate, or does it line up with expected losses? So these are some of the things that are going on here. Why is it that you have these kind of troubled positions? I mean, that is a kind of strict pacifism and then just war and so forth. I think it was nicely said today in the service. This is Palm Sunday. When Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, that's not the way kings ordinarily ride into capitals, you know. Kings ride into capitals, kind of a big deal, and they get the keys to the city, and they got soldiers with them, and look, this guy's on a donkey, and he's got people chucking their coats and stuff on the ground. It's almost an anti-parade, you know. It's almost a comical parade. No political person goes in like that. Just wait around for the next big parade you see from someplace, you know? I mean, I don't know, a big one with Putin or somebody like that going along. He's not riding in on a donkey with people just chucking coats on the ground. They're very different. Jesus' parade is almost an anti-parade, you know, and that sort of stuff. And what kind of king do you get? Well, I mean, it's not like the Gospels have tried to keep this a secret. When you start off in the Gospel of Luke, Caesar Augustus says everyone needs to go be enrolled, right? And everybody has to go home to get counted. Oh, well, let's think this over a little bit. I mean, you want to go to your hometown to be counted right away? I mean, if I go to my home, where I was born, I'd have to go to Indianapolis. And look, this is without planes, trains, and automobiles in the Roman Empire. You want to take a couple of weeks for me to go to Indianapolis? Does this sound like a good way to run an economy to anybody? It's probably not historically reconstructible, but what you do want to understand is, Caesar says go, and they all go. And one of them that goes in his mom's belly is Jesus, gets born and stuck in a feed trough. Now, this is all very intentional in the Gospel of Luke, see? Caesar Augustus, high, tough guy, wearing breastplates. He has united the Roman world with armies. Jesus, little shot, stuck in a feed trough. Who's the really important king? Well, this guy. Now, this is a very strange thing to say. And it's being said again when you get to Palm Sunday and people throwing coats and stuff on the ground and coming in on a donkey. This is almost like an anti-parade for a king. Kind of, so he's a peculiar king. And since he's such an alternative king, if you want to follow him, it's hard to do what people generally do when they follow the big shot kings, right? That is, hey, look, Augustus isn't going to ask you whether or not his war is just. I don't want to tell you anything you don't already know. He's just going. And he's got an interesting political figure. Okay, so you've got these stances more or less because of that. There are some aspects of the justice of going to war that inform the, inform the United Nations Charter. That's one place where some of the international law is. And, you know, the United Nations, God bless it, is a troubled institution, right? I mean, that's always been true. It's been true since it was founded in 1948. You couldn't get the big powers to play ball unless there was a Security Council so they could negate anything that the General Assembly voted on. Meanwhile, you wanted to get everyone in the General Assembly, and a lot of smaller powers wanted to be in it because, well, would you like to be left out of the big thing for international relations? There's a lot of politics going on in this. And then you know, one can always say, well, you know, the Security Council can negate all this stuff. And why did they have all these big nations in the Security Council? None of them wanted to cede any kind of power or military power to an international organization that might supersede their own interest, right? None of them. That's what they're. That's fine, and it's what you can expect on planet Earth. Now, then you go to the General Assembly, and someone can say, well, General Assembly is really nice because it's one country, one vote, and that's democratic. And it is in a way, till you figure out who the representatives are of the different countries. I mean, they're chosen by their home governments. Not all of those governments are democratic, right? You know, it's telling you anything you don't already know. So the United Nations is a really important institution, right? It means a place to discuss things and do things. But it does have its flaws, right, when it comes to different sorts of ways of trying to operating, and it is somewhat troubled. Yes, sir?
A real quick question here about that preamble.
Yeah.
Is that from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a different document, but it also overlaps with this. And the stuff from the preamble that I got here, I've got part of one of the sentences, and the first sentence is pretty interesting. The United Nations, founded in 1948, it's on the heels of 2 world wars, right? So you want to understand that this is a difficult moment, and it really takes the heels of 2 world wars to get the nations to do even what they did. And you get something like, well, its objective primary aim to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, dignity, and worth of the human person. That's one of the big things going on there. And other part of the preamble, as it goes on a little bit, is to refrain from the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. And that goes to, in many respects, the justice of going to war, a kind of hesitation. We want to have some reasons for it. And they're hoping to prevent another world war. Now, whether that works, I mean, that remains to be seen, right? I mean, no one knows the answer to that question, right? I think it's also fun when you look at the history of things, how depressing it was for a number of thinkers and people to have to call the World War the First World War. It was a very depressing thing because it meant that it was one in a series. Up until that time, it was called the Great War or the World War. It's only one. So you see, the United Nations is founded under these circumstances. So you've got the preamble, which indicates that going to war is something that you want to be careful about, and so forth. And then you've got in chapter 7 of this thing certain articles. Article 41 says the Security Council will determine the existence of threats to peace and acts of aggression, and make recommendations on what measures not involving armed force may be taken. So that's one thing it's supposed to do. Those measures would be things like the interruption of economic relations, interruption of diplomatic relations, things of that sort. The next article says if those strictures prove inadequate, then the Security Council may act with armed forces. Now, of course, the Security Council has no armed forces of its own, right? Those are all donated by nations. And everyone here will be familiar, I think, that the Korean War was an act with the United Nations forces, but predominantly with American military and material, also Australian and a number of other countries. But China didn't really think of that as a sort of neutral move on the part of all nations of the world, right? And the soldiers came from particular places, the United Nations. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying the United Nations is a great thing with ambiguities, is all. And then this Article 51 follows that and says that nothing in this charter shall impair the inherent right of an individual or collective self-defense if there is an armed attack. So none of that is ever ceded anywhere. International humanitarian law, IL for short, has a number of provisions in it and can be kind of complicated. And they've been worked at various times since 1869. So there are a number of things in it. It applies to international armed conflicts, more so than to, quote, non-international armed conflicts, that is within a nation state. And this is because it's always been difficult, and maybe with good reason, but it's always been difficult to get nations to abridge their sovereignty or their authority within their own borders, right? So it's very, very difficult to do that. Part of what goes on in international law is simply to affirm the sovereignty of every nation. And you can see that that's an important thing to do. You can also see that there can sometimes be difficulties with that, depending on what a nation is doing internally to different populations within it. So the questions of human rights and extermination of whole populations, and these don't happen every day, but they happen with more frequency than anyone would really care to think. There is the question of the sovereignty of particular nations, an important question in international law. Then there are the humanitarian law intends to be universal, but you want to understand that not all nations have ratified all aspects of international humanitarian law. So, for example, there is the International Criminal Court, The Hague, and the United States does not recognize the International Criminal Court, right? So the recognition of the international law is not, is not as uniform or universal as sometimes the rhetoric sounds, for a variety of different reasons. Okay, so you want, the International Criminal Court has done stuff once in a while. Right? It condemned Pinochet in Chile, and then when Pinochet traveled, he was apprehended, in Spain, I think it was anyway, something like that. But there are other American leaders who could also sometimes come up in International Criminal Court. We don't recognize the court, see? And we're not the only ones who don't recognize the court. Please don't misunderstand me. It's just, so you've got interesting things here. They're hardly perfect. Okay, then there are other sorts of things that we can say about international humanitarian law. Certain weapons have been banned, nerve gas following First World War, and things. The basic criteria that connect with justice in the conduct of war, that is, the just war tradition is much older than international law, right? Just war tradition starts way up back there with Greek philosophers and stuff, and then this other thing we're talking about starts in 1869, so that's a latecomer, right, in that. But some of the international law does track elements of certain aspects of just war theory. So let me just try and go through some of those. The justice in conduct of war, discrimination, non-combatant immunity, right? You're not supposed to attack non-military targets directly. That's a feature of international humanitarian law. It's a feature of just war theory. What sorts of things are included there? Medical facilities, schools, residential neighborhoods, etc. Other aspects of this have to do with non-combatants keeping away from military targets. So if I am defending, let's say I'm in charge somewhere, and I shouldn't put missiles next to schools, right? And missiles next to hospitals. What I've done there then is I've tried to shield a legitimate military target with something that's not legitimate. So this can be a complicated criterion in practice, but it's a sort of important one. And then you have other things about the use and the honest use of different sorts of signs and emblems. So a red cross on a facility indicating that it's a hospital facility or a medical facility is not supposed to be a direct item for attack. A red crescent also, see. Can some of those signs sometimes be misused? Look, you're alive on planet Earth, right? And any sign for anything can be misused by somebody, and sooner or later is. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't have the signs. It doesn't mean that. A lot of moral norms are like that, right? If you ask about them, like, well, people should never embezzle, or cheat. Well, of course they do. I mean, that's why you have the norm. You can, fidelity in marriage. Okay, well, just norms are not. You don't come up with norms because everyone perfectly follows them. You come up with them because sometimes you don't, right? Okay, so you have discrimination there. That's one of the big elements of international humanitarian law that also is a feature of the longer just war tradition. The other one, proportionality, wants to say that you should use no more force than is necessary for your mission. And that, obviously, a kind of judgment of art in some ways to try and make, but you can see the sort of thing it's pointing to. Let me just then try and make use of just war criteria and international humanitarian law criteria to talk about the current war conflict, the United States and Israel and Iran, and increasingly some other nations there. You want to keep in mind when you do these things that it's often very difficult to obtain accurate and complete information when you're estimating a current conflict. It's not that easy even when you're estimating a past conflict part of the time. A current conflict, not so easy, right? So people's estimates of, like, for instance, whether or not Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction ready to go were a little different at the time that we entered into that war than they are later, and significantly so. Right? There's some question there about the Secretary of Defense. We don't need to go into all of that. So justice of going to war criteria. Just cause. What's the question that's going to get talked about with respect to just cause, with respect to the U.S. involvement with Iran now? The question that's going to get talked about is the question of imminent threat. See? Was there an imminent threat? How do you define imminent threat? That, in turn, is going to have to do with the readiness of Iran's nuclear program. At what stage is it? And also the readiness of their missiles and their range and the way that they're being used. That's the kind of question that is going to raise. There's an additional question, which is, what has to be threatened imminently, right? And ordinarily in just war theory, it needs to be your own territory, right? So we can talk about American bases maybe being under threat in some respects in other parts of the world. Whether or not that works with just war theory is an interesting question. Probably the answer is no, see? So you've got that kind of thing. Now, obviously, if you are the state of Israel, you might calculate this differently, right, with respect to your own territorial integrity. It's possible. Meaning what? Meaning that Iran's missiles can reach Israel, right? So far as we know, they can't reach North America or something like that. They don't have the equipment. All right. So that's the kind of question that's going to get raised there. With respect to right intention, the question that's going to be raised is the matter of the chief objective or purpose of the war. What is the chief objective or purpose? You've probably seen a lot of the same reports I've seen. The current administration has articulated a variety of different possible aims and purposes. They're not all completely unified, right? So, for instance, sometimes they're talking about regime change. Sometimes they're talking about eliminating current missile capability. Sometimes they're talking about eliminating a nuclear capability or a nuclear program, the research program. And then sometimes they're talking about resetting power relations in the Middle East, which appears to be, in part, what the leadership in Saudi Arabia is most interested in. Hard a little bit to say how all that goes. All I want to point out here is that when you have that many different objectives floating around, it's a little hard to know what your chief objective or purpose is, and why is that going to be important? How do you know when you've met your chief objective if you're not sure what your chief objective is? You see, I mean, that's the kind of problem that when you hit your chief objective, then it's supposed to end. But if you don't know what the chief objective is, it's a little hard to, it's a simple enough point, right? And it's one of the reasons why that criterion is there. Last resort, the question that will come up there is the question of whether negotiations were cut short. It is clearly the case that there have been negotiations between this country and Iran. Those do exist and have existed. One question is whether they were cut short or should have been kept going longer. You can see people could reasonably disagree about that kind of thing. And now, they might disagree. Presumably, they would disagree on the basis of whether or not they thought there was an imminent threat, right? If you think there is an imminent threat, then time for negotiations gets cut at a certain point. Okay. With respect to the justice of going to war, there is this question of a reasonable hope of success, which is supposed to be important. You're not supposed to take off on a war where you don't have a reasonable hope of success. It is the case, right, that if you don't know what your chief objective is, it's a little hard to know what constitutes a success, right? So you've got an ambiguity there with respect to these things. Justice in the conduct of war. Discrimination and targeting is going to be a thing there. Now, I used to go up to the War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania on a regular basis and talk with people there. It is a very impressive institution, really, or it has been at different times. And that's where the U.S. Army sends people who were enlisted people who are becoming officers, right? So these are enlisted people who have, well, sort of risen to the top a little bit, huh? And they're getting additional training. They didn't go to West Point, right? So they're getting additional training in Carlisle, Pennsylvania at the War College. It's an impressive institution. Includes representatives of different armed forces, but it's predominantly Army. Incidentally, you know, while it's always fun, right? I mean, a bunch of the Marines think that the people in the Navy and half the people in the Army think the guys in the Navy are, I don't know, a little soft, right? They're on boats and have better food or something. You just did this, the kind of stuff that you will hear all the time around armed forces people. And then, of course, then you've got people like the Navy SEALs, and you know, you got like, you're supposed to see the resume of the person, and it's blank. You know, if you're the teacher. Wow, that's an interesting thing. So, an interesting place. In fact, there are courses in just war theory at the U.S. Army War College, right? I mean, that's part of what they study, and they get courses that include reading, you know, I don't know, Aristotle and Augustine, right? Better courses in that than at most colleges or universities. Anyway, just what we got. And they get trained there. I do want to say there that very many of the people there are concerned about the question of targeting. Right? The question of targeting is not something that only a bunch of moralists talk about. The U.S. military also has people who work on targets, and they try and get information on targets. And one of the questions that came up now with the Iranian school being hit, which was some proximity to a military base, but also distinguishable from it, was at one point part of the military base. And one question was whether the information on the targets was up to date. And if it wasn't up to date, why isn't it up to date? And you know, did you rush too quickly or something, or did someone simply make a mistake? Targeting can only be as good, finally, as what you know about the targets. And you can know a lot of things about targets from the air, but you can't know everything about targets from the air. You don't know when people are in the targets, and you don't have the latest information that you could have with people on the ground. But of course, to have that information, you have to have somebody there. So spies is what we're talking about now, okay? And you don't always have that. You may recall that in a war with Kosovo, in Kosovo, the Clinton administration did not want to put boots on the ground, and so they kept going down target lists on stuff. And they did prove that you could go pretty far without putting boots on the ground. But the further you go down the target, A target list are targets that are clearly military and clearly distinct. Right? B, a little less. C, D. You get down to D, and it's tougher. And you know, we hit the Chinese embassy by mistake. it's a mistake, but it's a mistake for going down a target list. I don't know what to tell you there. The people at the War College would tell you similar things about target lists. Okay, so discrimination has to do with targeting. Now, there are other things, infrastructure, energy infrastructure, which I think the president has mentioned recently. Of course, the president is a relatively loquacious president when it comes to some of these things, and so he's likely to mention very many things. It's hard to know exactly what the mentioning always means, but this is one of the things. Water supplies, and then urban neighborhoods. Really, in terms of international humanitarian law and just war theory, you really shouldn't hit the energy infrastructure completely, see, or the water supply or something like that. You shouldn't directly target it. What's directly targeted is not always what's hit, right? There is such a thing as collateral damage on targets. One, the munitions are somewhat precise, but nothing is immaculately precise. And two, the information, so forth. And three, things sometimes go in different places. So you can have that. You don't want to directly target these things is the idea. Proportionality with respect to objectives and conduct of the war, it might be helped if there were greater clarity about the overall intention or purpose of the war. That might help you there. So those are some of the things that would come up working with international law and just war theory. And those are the sorts of things that then one would expect to have be a part of a public conversation about a war. And I think to some extent and degree, we do have public conversations about that. Now, do they all work out real well? Look, you read the papers, I read the papers. I mean, how balanced and careful are a lot of the things that show up even in pretty sophisticated, well-to-do newspapers? Well, that's debatable. These days, even the grammar is debatable in those newspapers. I can't, no one proofreads anything. I don't understand it. The New York Times was supposed to be able to put together a sentence, and very often does, but not as well as it used to. And boy, the Herald Tribune, that no longer exists. Some of you may remember the Herald Tribune, but fortunately for it, it no longer exists. So most of its articles, if you go back there, are grammatically pretty good in any case. Those are the sorts of things that you have in a public discussion. If you go in this direction with it. I think if you go in this direction with it, the current war in Iran is a highly questionable enterprise. And you can see that by going through the criteria. I can't say that I have all the relevant information at my fingertips, and I can't verify much of the information that I might have access to. And it wouldn't be my judgment to make immediately in any case. But I think a Christian community caring about justice, a little worried about being overly zealous with military engagements, etc. like that, would have reasons to be quite concerned, I think, be the sort of thing you could say. There are some other involvements once in a while that work out more happily than this. But I'm perfectly willing to talk this stuff over, and I don't think my judgments are infallible by any stretch of the imagination. You have to go to a higher authority for that, I think. Yes.
At the end of a course in Christian ethics, what is your chief objective for the students looking at, let's say, 20 students in a class?
Yeah.
What do you expect out of 20 students in terms of their reaction to, let's say, a just war or any kind of morality of good and evil and right and wrong?
Well, the biggest thing I'm hoping for in those classes is, one, some sort of more sustained acquaintance with a Christian tradition and texts, etc., so that the students understand there is a body of stuff there. I think students intuitively understand that to begin with, but sometimes their intuitive understandings of it are not as developed as they might be. So, for instance, you know, a lot of my students have big ideas of what's in the Bible, and some of them work out pretty well and some of them don't. And so it's never superfluous to have them read parts of the Bible, right? Just to see what's in there. A lot of what people sometimes expect to see in there, or they've been told is in there, maybe it's not so clear. So we have that. Most of my students don't have a big acquaintance with some major figures in Christian tradition and some of the challenges they responded to. So we want to talk about Augustine and the fall of Rome and military power and things like that. We want to talk over things about Hutterites and Amish and their history and that kind of pacifism involved there and what the point is, because I think, you know, there are still sometimes at colleges courses like nonviolence, does it work? I thought, well, what kind of a title is that? Well, what's it supposed to work toward? A good Hutterite or Amish person isn't going to tell you they're nonviolent because they expect it to have great consequences. They're nonviolent because they're following Jesus. That's it. See you later. And then we'll see. Might have to go to the cross. Might not be successful at all. So my students, I think, need to understand that sometimes a nonviolent witness is not just an attempt to control history or get it to turn out right. I want them to see that. I want them to see some stuff with civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr., not all civil laws are moral laws. Now, how do you make that judgment? How did he make it? That kind of stuff. I want them to see a bunch of stuff like that, and other things about industrial revolution and working conditions, you know, and the social gospel, and why would anyone ever think that it's a bad idea for people in the garment industry to be locked into a room that they can't get out of to work, and then the thing burns down and they can't get out. I mean, these are actual things that happen in New York, in the garment district at different times. Okay, so I want them to see all that kind of stuff, and I want them to try and access it. I want them also to think about how they're going to work with this and their own convictions, and I want them to try and start constructing their own stances a little bit. But I would like the stances, I don't want to tell them what stance to, I mean, there is some variety there, but I would like them to be working in a ballpark that respects these sources and understands that they need to encounter something other than just their own preferences when they operate. I would also like them to know theologically that if you've got a good doctrine of sin, one of the things it means is that nobody is entirely righteous. And that's very important, I think, for not only the student working at their own position, but for your estimation of other communities and so forth. And it's not like my community has alone escaped with complete righteousness and someone else is at fault, you know. I mean, that's a little too simple. So those are the sorts of things that I care about. Does it always work out? I'm sure it doesn't always work out. But I've had some really good students. I'm happy to have had them all. They're fun.
Then you hope that they become decision makers.
Yeah,
At some point in the future.
right, and that they'll point sometimes to the values from the past and also the present, etc., and ask about their relevance, and ask a little bit about. We spend a little time on how do you try to interpret a situation or a circumstance, the number of different perspectives on it you might want to take into account, because that's important, right? I mean, it's how do you figure out what's going on, right? That's not always so easy, and you need to ask about that and what counts. And you also need to understand that people can make different judgments about that, and you can make mistakes, right? Yeah. Mostly, I hope they'll do something like that with some moral problems. The other thing is just that they'll give it a shot and try to lead lives that are faithful and good. One of my favorite things is a bunch of Puritans. You know, Puritans have this idea that you don't want to become a monk, right? All the Puritans are against that, and they're a little overly polemical when they talk about monks, right? I mean, the monks do some good things, but Puritans don't like this. You know, it's just a monkish life separated from the world, and that's not a bad idea. It's special, you know, I don't want any of that. But they do, so they want you to talk about the calling to be a Christian, and then the particular callings that people have. And the calling to be a Christian, roughly, for these characters, is that you should love God and neighbor. Right? Every Christian's supposed, that's the common calling to be a Christian. But they're afraid if all you do is that, and you don't engage in any particular enterprises, it might become kind of an abstract spirituality that we don't really trust. You know, you're getting too churchy or something like that. We don't like it. So they want you to also to have particular callings. So you could take someone and just do a footprint, you know. I'm a father, I'm a spouse, I'm a professor, I'm a citizen, all these things are roles, see? And they involve me in certain aims and practices. And the question is how those aims and practices, can I do them? And can them become ways of loving God and neighbor, see? And to what extent and degree do they have to modify them in order for that to work out? Now, that's wonderful Puritanism for you. They're admitting that people have a whole bunch of different involvements, that you learn things in those involvements. They don't want to say that a theologian can teach you how to be a physician. That's wrong. You need to go to medical school. It's a matter of moral importance that you do, and that you get good training, and that a place keep up good medical schools and stuff like that. It's a matter of moral importance that if you're a physician, however, they will say that you help the poor as well as those who are able to pay. Otherwise, we suspect that maybe the saving of persons' lives and health is not your chief objective. There's some other chief objective, like just making money. So this is all stuff out of Puritans, right? And they're really great. And what I'd like to say is that if you're a Presbyterian, going to a wonderful church here, that's part of your heritage, you see. That's part of your heritage with people trying to figure out how to be faithful in a world of many different involvements. How do you be a citizen and faithful? How do you be a physician and faithful? How do you be a lawyer and faithful? How do you be an auto mechanic and faithful? And you can go through that kind of stuff chapter and verse. They didn't have auto mechanics, but it's the same point. I used to live around the corner from Decatur's Garage in Richmond, Virginia. I was glad I was around the corner because when my cars failed, I could push them. Anyway, but so this guy had a shop with 3 bays, right, that you go in with cars. He employed 2 full-time mechanics and himself. And you could ask about his moral responsibilities and aims. One, he has to know how to fix cars. And you have to learn that somewhere. You can survive an incompetent professor a lot more easily than you can survive an incompetent mechanic working on your brakes. I'm not telling my students anything they don't already know. They're going to drive on Route 77. They need a mechanic who can work on brakes. It's a matter of moral importance that a mechanic be a good one and learn how to do that. That's a really important thing. Well, it's also important that, so this guy needs to employ mechanics, know what they're doing. They need to know what they're doing. He also needs to make a profit. He's not going to redo the whole economic system here. He needs to make a profit so that they can be paid, so that they can take it home to their families, and he can be paid. So he needs to run this business in a creditable and efficient way. And he needs to provide a good service, a competent service at a fair price, and keep going and make some money. He has to do all this kind of stuff. He needs also to figure out how other publics are affected by his operation. Mostly at that sort of thing, it's a question of what you do with used engine oil, you know, and where you put it. You're not supposed to just dump it in the sewer anymore. You're supposed to put it in a tank. Someone comes by and sucks it out and takes it somewhere. All that kind of stuff. We haven't yet included the morality of investing in a corporation because he's not big enough for that. But then you could see that a return on investments to investors is not a morally neutral thing. There's people's pensions and stuff like that. I'm not saying you should only have returns to investors, but that is one of the responsibilities of a corporation. So you go through all this kind of stuff, and you can thank the Puritans for it, in part. They do think that you ought to try and lead a creditable, faithful life in a world, and they think that there's a lot of things going on, and that a theologian can't tell you what they all are. Right? And so, you know, God bless them for that. There are other things about the Puritans that perhaps are not as happy, but we don't have to go into all that now. A lot of the styles of dress weren't the best, I think. There's other things like that. How are we doing? We doing okay? Let me just say, I think that if you're going to church here and stuff, you participate in a grand tradition. And that tradition has thought of a bunch of stuff. It hasn't always been right. And it needs correction, but it is worth consulting to try and figure out how you might proceed. And one of the aspects of that tradition has to do with nation states and the conduct and going to war. Those things are worth looking at. They don't solve everything, and there are still ambiguities when you do, but I think it is worth doing it. And particularly if you're a citizen in a country where you have a voice and you have representatives. I know that the country doesn't do exactly what you and I say, and I'm not saying that, but you have some voice, and it's worth monitoring these things. Okay?
I'd like to speak for all of us and thank you for the lecture.
Oh, you're very kind. I enjoyed being here very much. Thank you. Thank you.